Check it out. Diggy dang, diggy dang, diggy dang, diggy diggy dang, diggy dang, diggy dang.
So moving on to his supporting cast, we have the other superhero on the show, the guy who in later seasons shared the show's title with Batman, Richard Grayson, or as you might know him if you're from fucking Mexico, Ricardo Tapia. The first thing that sticks out about this Batman is how he compares to the common preconception that's so integrated in pop media. He's not that ah shucks, holy ravioli type of character that we're all so accustomed to. He actually has his own inner conflicts that he has to deal with, mainly how Batman overshadows him, and the way he should go about crime fighting, compared to his mentor. Visually, he resembles the Robin at that time, Tim Drake, adopting the R insignia. He's got that Billy Armstrong thing going on with his hair, and the more noticeable change, they gave him pants. Thank God they gave him pants. One thing is to have the underwear on the outside, but another thing entirely is to only wear underwear. And on a fucking 8-year-old. One thing is a Martian, but a fucking 8-year-old? Why is the people in the 30s went crazy over how much skin women showed, but watching an 8-year-old's thigh is totally fine? You know, man, I'm telling you, there's only one underage superhero that can rock the only underpants look, and it sure hell isn't Robin. At the start of the show, he only appeared occasionally, being that he was aged up to the college age due to television censorship regarding violence depicted on children, and as such, he was excused by saying that he was out in college when he didn't appear. But later on in the series, network executives pushed for the character to be featured more prominently in order to tap into that younger audience that they wanted so badly, resulting in the renaming of the show to The Adventures of Batman and Robin in later seasons. And while I do admit that the majority of the best episodes of the show were the ones that had Batman going solo without Dick, but to me at least his more prominent inclusion in the show didn't really feel forced, even if it was literally forced. You really should try to avoid forcing Dick onto others. But it didn't feel all that forced to me, mainly because of his chemistry with Batman. Only adds to the show in my opinion. Never does he detract from what's going on in the show or annoy you. The writers definitely knew how to implement him into the plots, and how he complemented Batman. He was definitely well realized as a character, and in big part because they knew the way the character contrasts thematically with Batman, as showed in the award-winning 2-part episode depicting his origin, Robin's Reckoning, in which Batman hunts down Robin's parents' killer, showing masterfully the way in which Batman sees himself in this young orphan who's seen his own parents die in front of him just like he did, and relates to all the feelings that he's going through at that moment. The rage, the desire for vengeance, the impotence for not being able to do anything to avoid it, the loneliness and sadness. This 2-part episode perfectly encapsulates why the Batman and Robin dynamic works so well, even if on paper it sounds totally weird and inappropriate. Of course, Robin isn't the only character that contrasts in a way with Batman. It happens with the rest of the supporting cast and characters as well. Not only are they all well written, developed and characterized all on their own right, but they also have a unique way of relating to Batman. Focusing on the Gotham Police Department, have one of the most important characters in all the Batman mythos who actually debuted with Batman himself, Commissioner Gordon, who I gotta say is portrayed exceptionally well in the show by his voice actor, the late Bob Hastings, who actually played the animated Superboy in the 60s. How about that? The show excelled in portraying the relationship between Batman and Jim Gordon properly, showcasing what each sees in the other and why they complement each other so well as protectors of Gotham and fighters for justice. Batman sees in Gordon a surrogate father. He serves to fill a void left by his father as a paternal figure in his life, and as such serves as a reminder of why he's on his crusade and why it's so important to maintain the promise that he made to his parents.
He's a friend. More than a friend. Jim Gordon's the same age my father would have been if he hadn't.
And Gordon sees in Batman a chance to fight injustice and corruption in a way that he knows neither he nor the law will ever truly be able to do, especially in a city like Gotham, and in that way saving countless lives in instances that the police simply could never do.
Gotta keep fighting, never stop. What I try to live by. Maybe if I'd been younger, could have been like you. Always wanted to be a hero.
You are a hero, Jim.
Now, this is actually kind of funny because last year he actually took up the mantle of Batman with a big ass mech and a mohawk. It was actually kind of neat, I swear to God. Also, if we're talking about parental figures in the life of Batman, we have to mention Dr. Leslie Tompkins, a friend of Thomas Wayne who comforted a young Bruce after the death of his parents and serves as a moral consultant for Bruce when he's in doubts about what he's doing. And of course, we have to talk about Alfred, the surrogate father in Bruce's life, who's just as delightful and as witty as ever, gotta say.
Yes, I admit it. I am Batman.
I actually thought he was the Joker. Pat yourself on the back if you got that. Seriously, you're awesome. Anyway, Alfred's awesome. In this show and everything Batman ever, he's just awesome. More often than not, the writers use Alfred as a vessel to communicate to the viewer or to Batman directly their own perspectives and insights of what Batman and his crusade means. That's why often in the comics he serves as a narrator to many of stories, and in this show it's no exception. The expression he gives the first time he sees Bruce in costume is to me one of the best series in the entirety of the show. So we talked about how Batman's allies relate to him. Now it's time to talk about what many consider to be the greatest rogues gallery of all time. Much like Batman, the majority of villains that comprise his rogues gallery are deeply disturbed individuals, most likely mentally unstable, who've been molded by traumatic experiences in their lives, be it tragedy, abuse, getting friend-zoned, or just being too damn old, and how they choose to externalize the conflicts going on in their minds. It's a connective tissue that holds and relates this group of villains with each other and their antagonist. Much like how Spider-Man's rogues gallery showcases the dangers of scientific progress gone wrong, or how Iron Man's rogues gallery are all offensive racial stereotypes. Naturally, these villains were all superbly characterized, providing with classic iterations of these characters that cement themselves into your brain and won't ever leave you. They all just feel like who they're supposed to be, and in some cases even manage to improve distinct aspects of these characters from their comic counterparts. The prime example of this being Mr. Zero, or Mr. Freeze as the show reinvents him, where they grabbed a pure gimmick villain and gave him actual depth and character. But they also managed to add different elements to characters that made them better realized or complete, like Two-Face having a pre-existing bipolar disorder, or improving him visually by way of his design. That solid black and white suit encapsulates the character's conflict of justice and injustice much better than the previous comic book designs of the character, and fucking miles better than Batman Forever's version with Tommy Lee Barachi Jones over there. The show is noteworthy for the way in which they present the psychological adversities that their villains are going through, often in a way in which we can empathize with them, never outright excusing or justifying their actions, but presenting them in a more humanizing light where we can at least understand how they feel and how they came to be. They also contrast with our hero in a way that shows how different aspects of Batman's persona could be deranged to an extreme that foments chaos and suffering rather than justice, such as instilling fear in people just because of your own perverted fascination with the concept, letting yourself go completely cold as a response to the great pain you've suffered, to let yourself be consumed by the different identities you've adopted in your mind, or the way he could fight crime and affect the world with his resources and skills if he didn't have his moral code. They are also very grounded in the way each speak to an aspect of the human condition that many of us had to deal with, like issues of personal image or cases of abuse. One of my personal favorite scenes depicting the inner conflicts of a villain in the show comes from the episode Second Chances, in which Two-Face kidnaps himself so that he could avoid getting plastic surgery that would leave Harvey Dent with his complete face again. And as he's hanging from a building about to drop to his death, Batman reaches to him, trying to help him. Just look at that expression of fear as he's dropping. That is a perfect display of his bipolar disorder at hand, as Harvey Dent reaches for Batman with a genuine desire to be saved and be well, while his two-faced side takes over and completely rejects salvation, as Harvey Dent can't do anything to stop him. Inside this rogues gallery, amidst all the wacky, gimmicky comic book foes, we can also find a few gangsters and mafiosos thrown in there, which serve to ground the show a little, being that it shows that Batman not only has to face against fantastical threats conceivable only in imaginative scenarios, but also very real threats, and he has just as much of a problem taking them down as he has with his psychotic supervillains. And one time he acknowledges that he is more likely to die from just some random goon than in an epic fight against one of his supervillains. We can also take notice in the influence the '89 Batman movie had on the show while looking at the rogues gallery. Ronald Daggett was actually going to be Max Schreck originally, and just look at the Penguin. I mean, is that Joe Pesci? John Belushi? No, that can't be. John Lovitz? No, wait, it's Danny. It's Danny, you guys. It's Danny. Yeah, as the legend goes, Bruce Timm made the Penguin design based on the look of Danny DeVito on Batman Returns, so there's that. Also, the Joker has more than a few similarities with the Burton version, most noticeably him having an actual identity this time around, the same one as the movie version. He's Jack Napier, a mob enforcer. Only in this version, he doesn't kill Batman's parents, thank God. Also, while I'm speaking of the Joker on this show, I'm gonna throw a wild fucking opinion, one that's never been said before. I have this wild opinion that he's one of the best incarnations of the character in all of his existence. And I do think that Mark Hamill is the best person to portray him today. It's almost unbelievable just how right Mark Hamill's voice is for the part. He embodies all the characteristics needed for the Joker. He's energetic, completely nails his unpredictable mood swings, and manages to be both funny and genuinely menacing in his demeanor. This show might have been intended for a pre-teen demographic, but it most definitely knew how to convey a world and situations that actually felt mature. For instance, they never really showed on-screen deaths for the most part, but it never shied away from acknowledging death and treating the topic with the weight and impact that death has. Or take the criminal activities, for instance. We never get to see these criminal operations in detail, but thanks to the serious tone in which we presented to them, we know that these crimes that are committed are genuine and serious offenses, just like they are in real life. We feel the gravity of the situation when they talk about drug trafficking and extortion rings because they treat them as such. Even if we never get to see in detail someone doing smack or someone getting beaten to death, you know? When they mention something like drugs, it's not like, drugs, kids, don't do them, they're bad, this your brain on drugs, this your brain on drugs. No, they don't talk to you with that fucking PSA talk, It's just like, yeah, drugs, they exist, they create problems in society. Like that, like it's a serious topic, as it is. And this show's depiction of the Joker is the best representation of implied awfulness. We might not be able to see him go to his extreme, like skinning a man alive or beating a Robin to death with a crowbar. But you always get the feeling that even if we're not seeing it, this crazy son of a bitch is most certainly capable of doing these things. I mean, just look at that. That's legitimately brutal. Kid show or not, man. Also, his Joker gas serves as a nice replacement for outright killing, and it gives him a cool signature. Besides, whenever the DC animated team actually had a chance to go full out with Batman, they always let the Joker cut loose, and it's awesome. Just go watch the crazy shit he did in Mask of the Phantasm, Return of the Joker, and his appearances during the Justice League cartoon. Those are all in the DCAU canon and prove how much of a crazy motherfucker he really is. Anyway, much like how this show completely understood the themes of Batman as a character, it absolutely nailed the relationship with him and the Joker. They should always feel like the complete antithesis of one another. The loud, colorful, laughing opposite of the dour and serious way of the Batman. The incarnation of nihilism and chaos. Random violence just for the sake of random violence stands in striking contrast against everything that Batman stands for, as his crusade was the product of one of those random, meaningless acts of violence. People often ask when they're confronted with the problems of life, why? Why me? Why did such an awful thing had to happen to me precisely? Why? Among everyone else in this fucking planet, why me? And the truth is, while we can do nothing but cry out to the sky, hoping and demanding a fucking answer like we deserve one, the truth is that there literally is no answer. More often than not, A lot of things can just be explained by shit happens. And unfortunately, it happened to you. Yeah, unfortunately, but it happened to you. What can you do about it? Literally nothing. Now, this entitlement and need and desire to get an answer that satisfies and gives us closure to a terrible thing that happened to us in our lives, and just to make sense out of it, is really one of the biggest causes of suffering and just torment in everybody's mind. And the Joker completely knows that there is no answer to those questions. He knows that everything is meaningless. Everything are just events that lead to another event. And again, this stands in striking contrast to everything that Batman believes in, that he can make a difference and minimize and actually preventing some of those terrible situations that happens in life. We could even state that Batman's desire to fight crime originates from that rejection of that lack of meaning and the terrible things that happen to us in our lives. And everything he does is to prove to Batman and to others just that nothing matters. And while doing so, he laughs. He laughs at them, he laughs at us, he laughs at himself, and more importantly, he laughs at Batman's face.
Sadly anticlimactic. Behind all the sturm and batarangs, you're just a little boy in a playsuit crying for mommy and daddy. It'd be funny if it weren't so pathetic. No, what the heck, I'll laugh anyway.
They complement each other like no other fictional rivalry. It's truly poetic in its nature. So I should also talk about the last season of the show, being that as the show moved from the Fox network to
Kids WB,
Kids, it went through an overall aesthetic redesign in order to make it match with their new spin-off of the show, Superman, the animated series. So they could bundle both shows in a 1-hour block called the New Superman Batman Adventures. This is something to keep in mind because in this season much of the focus went to trying to implement Gotham City into a larger, more interconnected world, and to do so, there was a bigger emphasis on the relationships between the cast of characters. That's why I prefer to call this season Gotham Knights, as Paul Dini originally wanted. It's just much more fitting since it really does feel more like a Bat Family show, with the protagonism now being shared between Batman and his protégés, which include Batgirl, being that this season is taking place 2 years after the original episodes. Batgirl became Batman's main crime-fighting partner after his fallout with Dick Grayson, who went on to adopt the Nightwing persona, and the Robin identity would later be taken on by a 13-year-old orphan named Tim Drake, whose only similarities he shares with the comic book Tim Drake are his name, really. He doesn't discover Batman's identity or lives with his parents or is a master detective or something like that. He basically has the personality of a younger Dick Grayson and the origin of Jason Todd. But of course this season is mostly remembered for the redesigns of the characters, mostly because of budgetary restrictions, opting for more minimal and angular designs which were less demanding to animate. The prime example of this being Clayface. I don't personally mind most of these aesthetic changes really. Some were great, like the Scarecrow, and others were shit. But they weren't really a deal breaker for me personally. The problem that I do have with the aesthetic changes is the fact that most of that feeling of otherworldly timelessness or noir atmosphere completely went away, at least for me. I mean, stylistically it didn't change, the art style was still Art Deco, but it just didn't manage to convey the same mood as the previous seasons. But again, this still isn't a deal breaker for me because the writing continued to be on point and the relationships between the characters, which was the focus of this season, were engaging and well realized. But they also had the opportunity to go a little more darker with the contents of each episode. They had changed networks and they didn't have the same restrictions. This allowed them to show a little bit of blood here and there and even actually show the first on-screen death on the show. Hell, Batman even kills a couple of crocodiles. Holy shit. Damn. One example of how this show changed in order to better fit with the larger DC universe is its depiction of magic. Whereas in previous seasons, the most supernatural thing we got to see was the Lazarus Pit, in this season we get to see Clarion the Witch Boy and Etrian the Demon digging around and whatnot, doing their thing, you know? Something that seems really out of place in a show like this, considering the previous seasons. We can also appreciate this change in content with the character of Satana, who in her introduction episode in the previous season, we never got to see explicit magic from either her or her father Satara, and instead they were merely portrayed as escapists and illusionists. But in her later appearances in the Justice League cartoon, she does use actual magic. So basically in that early episode she was basically lying to everybody. And fucking lying. Personally, even though it's overall kind of hit or miss, all the changes that they made in this season, I still found it to be a nice change of pace, honestly. The show throughout its run managed to be able to tell stories focusing solely on Batman, to Batman and Robin stories, and finally actually managed to tell stories focusing on the entire Bat family. So that's pretty commendable. The only thing that I would have liked to see them taking chances with would have been a story arc, since the Superman show was already doing one, and they would also later do one during the first season of Batman Beyond. But it also might have been too much of a change, so I get why they never did it. Now, seeing as how this show is more than 20 years old now, I mean, a few years down the road it's gonna be more than 30 years old, man. Holy shit. But one can't glance over how well the show has aged to our current eyes, accustomed to crisp, clear, fast-paced, digitally enhanced animation of our era. And while I do admit that there are some animation hiccups here and there that come off as a bit awkward, you know, not as awkward as something like Angelina Jolie kissing her brother on the mouth, but kinda awkward still. I'd say the show has aged fairly well when compared to other animated shows of the time, mainly in my opinion because they knew its strengths and weaknesses. They never went over their heads and tried to do faster-paced, overly complicated action fights, or God forbid, an attempt at early CG that would have stuck out like a sore thumb nowadays. I mean, just try to revisit the 90s Spider-Man cartoon sometime and just try not to cringe at that CG, man. Oh no. But instead it knew that its strengths laid on their storytelling and character examination, and as such, their focus went on to that, making it much more timeless in hindsight. So I should now probably mention the big elephant in the room for some people. This series and its merits might come off as a tad overrated for many people, and I get why. Many overly enthusiastic fans of the show treat it as if it was the greatest shit since fucking Peanut Butter and Chocolate, the magnum opus of all animation ever. Of course, this is all exaggeration, but keep in mind that if so many people love something with such passion, it must be because it did something right. Sure, there are exceptions, but this isn't Twilight. This was an expertly crafted animated series based on one of the most popular comic book characters of all time, which impacted greatly on its respective medium and the one it was based on. And with reason. I know you're sick to your fucking stomach of hearing how drastically different this show was from most other cartoons at that time, but it simply can't be overlooked. This was the dramatic equivalent of the mature sensibility shown in more adult-oriented cartoons at that time, like The Simpsons, and it proved to be something that resonated with many people. This was the type of show that everyone wanted to see. But I'm not gonna pretend like we would have never seen shows like this if Batman the Animated Series never existed. As if the fucking course of 21st century history was solely dependent on it. But it's undeniable the impact it had on the animation landscape as a whole. If it never came to be for some reason, I'm sure there would have been another serious, sophisticated cartoon would have risen and taken its place. I mean, the shift towards more mature-oriented animation and TV was already in motion for years now. And of course, we can't forget X-Men the Animated Series, another show that successfully managed to portray the themes of its comic book source material with the metaphors for social prejudice, racism, and the Malcolm X, Martin Luther King type dichotomy between Professor Xavier and Magneto. So I'm sure the shift towards more mature sensibilities and cartoons wasn't solely dependent on the existence of this show in particular. But the animation landscape definitely needed a show like Batman the Animated Series to come out and have an impact like it did to solidify the validity of this type of cartoons to exist. I mean, who can say for certain how different would the animation landscape would be nowadays if instead of Walt Disney's Snow White fairy tale adaptation being the first feature-length animated movie, it had been the action-oriented Bob Clampett's John Carter from Mars instead. Yeah, that was actually going to happen back in 1936, a few years before Snow White premiered, but it never got to fruition. But really though, in my humble opinion, the main reason why I appreciate this show so much, besides everything that this show did so right and the impact that it had, is because to me is the greatest example of the greatness that can come out when the executives in charge of a popular pop culture property put their faith in people that know how to recognize the core aspects that makes that idea work in the source material. You know, I'm always going to be the first guy to say that any work, that any adaptation to another medium is never meant to be for the audience that liked the source material. It just never is that way. It's always going to be targeted to a different audience, and as such, changes have to be made. A concept from one medium to another can't stay the same. There are some things that simply don't work in another medium. But that's exactly why producers and executives have to get people behind these projects that know how to recognize the core aspects and elements that make these properties great in the first place, you know, their main fucking appeal. Because yeah, things like the convoluted nature of comic books and some out there ideas that medium has have to be changed more often than not when transitioning to movies or something like that. But the main appeal of that idea isn't one of those things that you have to change. That's why people like the concept in the first place. You fucking idiots. People don't want to read a Green Lantern story to see a fucking rom-com or a generic superhero movie that tries to replicate poorly the Marvel formula. You know, and I'm also one that thinks that you don't need to be a huge fucking fan of that concept beforehand to actually work and try to tell a story about that. But you should always study what it is that people like about those concepts and ideas and characters and stories, because that's what you're making a movie about, you fucking idiot. In no way being a fan or being familiar with the concept is gonna guarantee that your adaptation is gonna be flawless. I mean, again, looking back at the Green Lantern example, there were a bunch of comic book writers that were helping out the movie, but the movie still came out as it did. So it never guarantees anything, you know? Or just look at Tim Burton. You know, he's made comments dismissing the comic book medium before and after making the 89 Batman movie. And that's totally fine, because at the end of the day, his Batman movie was still one of the greatest in the genre. And that's because he treated the source material with respect, and he studied it and recognized the best way to adapt that source material. He actually approached the project with actual thought and reasoned which was the best way to adapt that source material. So again, coming back to Batman the Animated Series in particular, it just goes to show the great things that a team of creative minds can achieve if they have the liberty to make the decisions that they feel it would be the best way to depict the source material that they're working with. That's why the show feels like it grabs the best aspects about Batman's history and combines it into one. And that's why I have nothing but admiration, appreciation, and complete and utter love for the people behind this show. Because what they managed to create was, quite frankly, something that literally feels like the essence of Batman. And at the end of the day, all that I can say, this show will always be, at least to me, the best way to introduce someone to the world of Batman. It simply is nothing else than completely and utterly fantastic.